Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this roundtable session on turning the tide on the plastic wave, material substitutes to single-use plastics in developing countries. So my name is Carolyn Deer-Burbeck. I am the director of the Forum on Trade, Environment and the SDGs TESS, based here in Geneva. It's our great pleasure to have supported UNCTAD in the organization of this event and to partner with them on their excellent work to support plastic-free ocean economies and sustainable manufacturing in developing countries. Now, UNCTAD, as you may know, was just granted by governments its most environmentally sustainable mandate ever. There's a focus in its new mandate on reducing waste, including by moving away from a linear economy towards more sustainable patterns of production and consumption. There's an emphasis on the circular economy and finding opportunities to reuse and recycle materials and reduce pressures on the environment. In addition, the circular economy, UNCTAD has been mandated to address the discharge of plastic litter and other waste in oceans and significantly reducing marine pollution of all kinds. And you'll see that UNCTAD has published a new paper today on enabling concerted multilateral action on plastic pollution and plastic substitutes. So at TESS, we work to promote dialogue and action on the nexus of trade, environment, and sustainable development, with the goal of supporting a trading system that addresses global environmental crises and advances the UN Sustainable Development Goals. A key area of our work is on the nexus of trade and plastic pollution and identifying ways in which work on this topic can address the priorities of developing countries. So at this roundtable today, we're delighted to have gathered speakers with different expertise related to the plastics challenge to discuss solutions that facilitate the substitution of single-use plastics by natural fibers and mineral materials in developing countries. It's also an opportunity to discuss insights from an upcoming study by UNCTAD, which is part of their Sustainable Manufacturing and Environmental Pollution Programme, sponsored by the UK Foreign Office, which explores the potential of substitute materials in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, and has some great case studies on Bangladesh, Kenya, and Nigeria. So this session today is part of a growing interest in Geneva in work around plastic pollution. And on this note, I'd also mention that a wider set of dialogues called the Geneva Beat Plastic Pollution Dialogues, which may be of interest. And I believe that David will put in the chat shortly an invitation to a related event on plastic waste in mountains. And there are several others in that series. So we have a fairly tight program. So I'll introduce our speakers and then we can dive in. Please do send any questions or post any materials you have that may be relevant directly in the chat. So we'll begin today with a 15-minute presentation by Mahesh Sugatan, who is a senior policy advisor at TESS and has been working closely with UNCTAD to support their work in this area. He's going to present an overview of some of the issues, challenges, and opportunities for trade policy tools to promote substitutes to single-use plastics, based on a recent study that he's undertaken for UNCTAD. And then we'll have commentary from three speakers, Daniela Garcia, who is a Deputy Permanent Representative, the Permanent Mission of Ecuador to the WTO in Geneva, followed by Alice Tipping, who is the lead on sustainable trade and fisheries at IISD, and followed by Mr. Arpit Bhutani, who is the Chief Operating Officer of the Circular Innovation Lab and a managing partner at Hind Agro Sales in India. So without further ado, I'll turn firstly to you, Mahesh, to tell us a little bit about your findings so far. You have the floor.
Thank you, Caroline, and good afternoon to everybody. I'll just share my screen as well. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So great. So good afternoon again, and great to be here. I'd also like to thank UNCTAD for giving me the opportunity to present some of the findings of the study that we at TESS did for UNCTAD. And it's going to be a sort of a context-setting study, looking what are the sort of trade tools or material transition to promote trade-supported diffusion of plastic substitutes. So I'll get straight into it. So what is the big context that we are looking at? I mean, we all know that plastics are widespread and they play a very useful role in the global economy, but it's also well recognized that there are adverse environmental impacts that are caused by the improper disposal and waste management of these plastics. Plastic pollution has a big negative impact on marine ecosystems, and marine life, and also on human and animal health as well. One of the biggest, the worst categories in this regard are single-use plastics. Now, what are single-use plastics? According to UNEP, they're also referred to as disposable plastics because once they're commonly used for plastic packaging, they are intended to be used only once before they are thrown away or recycled. So single-use plastic pollution has been found in beaches all around the world, and you're well aware of some of the negative impacts that it's caused. Now, why do we want to look at substitutes for single-use plastics? There are basically three imperatives that I'm going to mention. The first is that the use of plastics for a particular application may be useful and convenient, but inappropriate because of the short lifetime of use and the adverse environmental impacts that they cause because of inadequate waste management in many countries, but particularly in the developing world. Now, the reality is that in many developing countries, setting up this infrastructure is going to take a long time, as well as the facilities to manage plastic waste are inadequate. Now, because of the long time it will take to develop some of this infrastructure, it might be better for these countries to look at options to replace these single-use plastic products with substitutes, at least in the short to medium term. Now, thirdly, there are sustainable development and livelihood opportunities for developing countries that these plastic substitutes might offer. Now, there's a Pew report recently that looked at the role that different types of intervention could play in order to reduce plastic leakage to the ocean by 2040. Now, in this particular slide, what we see is that the substitution of plastic by compostable materials would constitute about could prevent about 17% of plastic waste generated by 2040, which is equivalent to about 71 million metric tons of plastic. Now, 95% of this potential substitution comes from key product applications, for which known materials already exist at some level of scale. Now, these include materials like monomaterial films, other rigid monomaterial packing, sachets and multi-layer films, carrier bags, pots, tubs and trays, and food service disposables. So while there are a number of, the switch to substitutes is only one of many interventions that can take place, but as you can see that 17% is not an insignificant amount. So countries would be, it would be really good for countries to look at what kind of substitutes could replace these single-use plastics. Now, what about SDGs? Now, there are SDG goals and targets which provide a good hook for pursuing options on replacing single-use plastics. One of them is SDG 12, which looks at ensuring sustainable consumption and production patterns, and also SDG 14, which calls for conserving and sustainably using the ocean, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. Now, what exactly are plastic substitutes and where can we draw the boundaries for the universe of plastic substitutes? So going a bit into the definition and scope, we could broadly look at two sort of materials. The first is traditional materials, which are based on naturally occurring polymers that are found in animals and plants, such as cellulose, chitin, and lignin, as well as non-renewable mineral resources found in nature, such as clay and mica. Or we could also look at materials which are synthetic or semi-synthetic in nature. Now, the issue with the latter category is that while the latter category is could be maybe derived from natural plants or animals, they are usually blended with chemicals, or they undergo chemical treatment or mechanical processing, which alters their structure. So that means that without having proper infrastructure facilities in place to treat this sort of plastic, it would be very difficult for countries to actually manage this sort of waste properly. So that's why in this presentation, as well as in the study, we focus on the first sort of materials, which are essentially traditional materials which are fully compostable and which don't need this additional infrastructure to handle them. Now, looking at the universe of substitutes, we find that there are a wide range of materials from which plastic substitutes can be produced. These include some of them which are well established, for example, jute, and sisal, etc. But there are also others which are fairly nascent. For example, there's algae, and there's wheat products like wheat straws, etc. So now the thing is whether countries could also look at these other new emerging materials as well. There are examples of companies which have started producing some of these plastic substitutes from alternative materials. For example, Ananas Anam is a UK-based company with subsidiaries in the Philippines and Spain, which uses pineapple leaves, which are blended with 20% polylactic acid to produce a material called Pinatex, which can be used as a substitute for products made out of leather or polymer-based leather substitutes, such as shoes, bags, furniture. There are other companies, for example, which produce water sachets from algae. But these are examples of very nascent products, and there's still a long way to go before they can be made commercially viable in the market. Now, in the third category on the right side, you can also see that they're non-mineral feedstocks, which are essentially glass, clay, ceramics, and aluminum. Now, there is a problem with disposal for some of these categories as well. I mean, they do take a long time to biodecompose in the soil, but at the same time, they're easily recyclable. And one of the good things, which also my colleague Henrique will be presenting more in his presentation, is that developing countries already have in place infrastructure facilities to recycle some of these materials. So compared to plastics, there could be a case for actually switching where it makes sense from these single-use plastics to these mineral-based feedstocks as well. Now, what could be some criteria for selecting appropriate substitutes? There are a number of criteria which could be explored. First is domestic feedstock availability and existing production of these materials. Environmental footprints for these materials based on life cycle analysis, durability and functionality, whether those materials are recompostable, reusable, or recyclable, the techno-economic feasibility of some of these materials, including pricing. What is the existing regulatory frameworks, taxes, incentives in place which discourage single-use plastics and promote substitutes? What are the trade policy frameworks in place, such as import duties, non-tariff measures, etc.? Now, these are a complex set of criteria, and obviously there will be some level of trade-off. For example, I mean, if you look at functionality, a lot of the plastic substitutes may not completely achieve perfect functionality in terms of the desired end users, but at the same time, they might have a lot of environmental benefits. So there will have to be a sort of a judgment call on where using some of these substitutes makes perfect sense and where they may not make that much of sense. Now, looking at some examples of substitute feedstocks, I'll go into a bit of detail on jute, abaca, coir, kenaf, and sisal, which are commonly known as JAX fibers. Now, these fibers are fairly well established in developing countries, and that's the reason why we also have very good data on some of the trade flows and the production as well. Now, looking at the producers, we see that developing countries are fairly well established in some of the production as well as the exports of these JAX fibers. Some of the fibers are more concentrated in some countries than others. So for example, jute is predominantly produced in Bangladesh and India. Coir is produced in India and Sri Lanka. Whereas if you look at sisal, there's a lot more developing countries which are active as producers for these. So these are sort of the established figures. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is also because it's easier to identify these JAX fibers as part of any sort of trade negotiations or market access negotiations going ahead. Some of the other products which are fairly nascent, for example, like algae, or whether it's products made out of banana leaves, for example, they're much more difficult to identify in the harmonized system. Now, what could be some trade-related tools to promote these plastic substitutes? First, I'll come to import tariffs. So import duties are a strong instrument by which countries can either discourage or encourage the import of many of the substitute products. So for example, when we look at JAX fibers, we see that a lot of countries have zero duties, for example, on some of the feedstocks, but they have much higher duties on the value-added products. Now, in general, what we find is that large developing countries apply higher tariffs on JAX fibers, and particularly on related manufactured goods. However, even in developed countries such as the EU, there is scope for further reduction in duties for certain value-added products such as coir floor matting and ropes of sisal and abaca. There's also scope for relaxing rules of origin for products in some of the preferential schemes. For example, EU's generalized system of preferences and everything but arms schemes. So relaxing rules of origin means that a lot more developing countries can benefit from the market access that is granted, because the rules with regard to processing and setting up value addition facilities, etc., would be fairly relaxed. Now, in addition to tariffs, what might even be more important as a barrier to some market access in plastic substitutes are non-tariff measures and standards. Now, in terms, while we're discussing standards, we have to be very clear about the differentiation between the different types of materials that are advertised. So for example, you have materials which are bio-based, there are materials which are biodegradable, there are materials which are compostable, oxo-degradable, recyclable, recycled. So there are all these different claims that can be made for products based on these criteria. Some products might share one or more of these criteria. Some products may share just one of them. So there has to be very clear standards or thresholds set for how producers are able to claim a certain product as bio-based or biodegradable. And unfortunately, we don't have that kind of uniform rules in place. So one more thing is, again, which are the main standard setting organizations that could be relevant for discussing standards for plastic substitutes? One of them is ISO, which sets the ISO standards. There's ASTM International, and there's the European Committee for Standardization. Now, most of the standards they're currently involved in and very active in are looking at plastics specifically, and looking at the chemical content of the plastics, biodegradability, compostability, etc. But I think there is also a case to be made for these standard setting bodies getting a lot more active in setting standards and criteria, even for the plastic substitute products. Now, what are some of the differences between standard, certification, label, and claim? Standard refers to specific criteria or norms of material goods or services, including packaging, which may also serve as benchmarks. I mean, there are mandatory standards which could be set by governments, and there are also voluntary sustainability standards that could be set by the private sector. Certification refers to the formal accreditation process. Label is a logo or stamp which highlights a product or service's specific characteristic, which could be also used as a form of trademark. A label may or may not represent a certification. A claim would refer to assertions made by companies about the beneficial qualities or characteristics of their goods and services. So it's also useful to differentiate between these different sort of nomenclatures when it comes to discussing standards. What are some of the non-tariff measures that might impact the exporters of JAX fibers? I mean, these include SPS measures, sanitary and phytosanitary measures that might include fumigation requirements, for example, packaging crates made of jute or sisal or other substitute materials, customs and administrative procedures, import licensing procedures, etc. For example, there has been some requirements in Australia, for example, which requires the producers of some of these substitute materials to actually use crops or use feedstocks which are pesticide free, which means in the production process of some of these products, you cannot be using any sort of pesticides at all. So these are just some examples of non-tariff measures. One of the important things to note is the EU Circular Economy Action Plan, which, although the impacts might be more on plastic and bioplastic materials, there might also be impacts on packaging materials which are made of substitute materials as well. So this would be an important law to monitor and to see what would be the implications for exporters of substitutes going forward, including developing countries. The other thing also I should mention is the requirements to ensure food quality and safety. Now, this means that often plastics might be indispensable, especially for countries that want to export fresh produce like food and flowers, etc. And there has to be some research and development perhaps that could help to see which kind of substitutes might actually help maintain these qualities. I mean, maybe they may not meet these qualities to the same extent as single-use plastics, but there might be other materials which could. So perhaps that's something that is also important, because a lot of these food packaging materials are single-use plastics, where, once you open the container, you would just throw away the plastic. And because of the fact that trade in these products, happens in both developed and developing countries, that obviously leads to implications for plastic waste, for generation of single-use plastic waste. Now, what is the second tool that we can look at? One of them is to ensure the clarity and visibility of some of these plastic substitutes within the harmonized system at the World Customs Organization. What we find is that the level of precision of the harmonized system varies quite widely with regard to the raw materials. So for example, products like jute have very clearly defined HS codes at the 6-digit level. They also clearly define codes for end-use products like jute bags and sisal ropes. There's no similar clear definition for other feedstocks that might be interesting. For example, banana or areca leaves, for example. There's also no subheading that could precisely capture certain other products. For example, aluminum bottles could be classified under 3 different subheadings. Aluminum casks, drums, cans, and boxes, table, kitchen, or other household articles, or other articles of aluminum. So for certain products, it might be that customs might actually be classifying in each country very differently for the same sort of substitute. Now, what can be done at the World Customs Organization? One of the issues at the WCO is that for a new HS 6-digit classification to come into effect, the product has to cross a certain trade threshold, which is usually $100 million for a 4-digit subheading and $50 million for a 6-digit subheading. But at the same time, there has been precedent in the WCO to have separate classification systems based on social and environmental reasons. So one of the arguments could be that for certain kind of plastic substitutes, it might be worth looking at whether this criteria can be relaxed so that we have very clear, distinct subheadings for plastic substitutes that can facilitate not only trade, but also tracking data and monitoring by customs authorities of these products. Now, where could some of these trade policy initiatives, whether addressing tariffs, non-tariff measures, etc., be pursued? One option that countries always have is unilateral trade action, which means that each country takes its own steps to liberalize tariffs and non-tariff barriers as they see appropriate. They could also introduce non-discriminatory taxes, charges, and requirements, both on single-use plastics as well as substitutes. They could look at green procurement policies. They could look at liberalizing relevant waste services sectors, for example, industrial composting and waste management. Now, for products like bioplastic or polylactic acid, I mean, it's very well known that without industrial composting facilities, you cannot have expanded trade, because expanded trade in PLA or bioplastic would only lead to exacerbating the problem of pollution. So the chicken has to come first before the egg. I mean, so in this sense, the industrial composting facility will have to be set up before any sort of huge trade in bioplastics take place if you want to avoid those sort of adverse effects. So I would argue that maybe it might be worth exploring the traditional substitutes first in terms of market access and trade liberalization, rather than going all in for some of these new materials like bioplastics and so on. Now, the other avenue where trade liberalization could be pursued are plurilateral, bilateral, and regional trade initiatives. These include plurilateral initiatives such as the Environmental Goods Agreement. It could be bilateral agreements, including South-South RTAs, because as we have seen for some of the traditional fibers like JAX fibers, developing countries themselves are the biggest importers of some of these products. So a South-South RTA would make perfect sense in terms of enabling other developing countries to access markets. And this also would include UNCTAD's Global System of Trade Preferences, GSTP, that was set up as a mechanism where developing countries would give preferential access to other developing countries. And perhaps there's also a case for this mechanism to be revived further. Finally, at the WTO, there's also opportunities to liberalize for environmental goods and services, that could be done multilaterally. There's already been examples of many environmental preferable products proposed during the Doha round negotiations. These include products like jute sacks and bags, sisal ropes, paper and paperboard items, agglomerated cork, natural rubber, etc. So the WTO is always perhaps the best avenue to pursue liberalization at a multilateral level. But obviously, because of the time constraint and the long time for negotiations, I mean, countries could also look at other avenues as well in the interim. What could be some of the other initiatives to support plastic substitutes? There could be trade and investment related initiatives that look at recovery, recycling, and composting, including through market access for relevant environmental services. This could cover not just traditional plastics, but also substitutes like aluminum, glass, and other substitutes that might need recovery and recycling at scale. Now, one of the things that developing countries is that there is a lot of labor-intensive models that are there for collecting these materials and managing them. So in terms of having operations at scale or investment at scale, it would be good to see how some of those models could be integrated rather than displaced, because we are also talking about labor intensive activities where a lot of there's a lot of livelihoods which depend on some of these traditional waste gathering and recycling activities. Countries could also look at attracting foreign investment in the area of manufacturing plastic substitutes. Now, this especially makes sense for some of these new and emerging materials that I mentioned earlier, such as algae, for example, where developing countries might lack the know-how or the technology to put in place operations to produce substitutes at scale. There could be access to technology and know-how, technical assistance, and capacity building pursued through initiatives like Green Aid for Trade at the WTO, where there could be a focus. For example, one of the sectors of focus could definitely be plastic substitutes. Now, at the WTO, I'd specifically like to conclude by referring to the ongoing informal dialogue on plastics and environmentally substitutes plastics trade. Now, this initiative, this informal dialogue was launched in November 2020 among a group of countries, and it was essentially a developing country-led initiative initiated by Fiji and China. And now, since 2021, it has 6 co-conveners: Australia, Barbados, China, Ecuador, Fiji, and Morocco. Now, most recently, the IDP has come out with a ministerial statement for MC12, where they have actually looked at plastic substitutes as one of the areas for further work. Now, as you can see, there are 66 countries that have joined this ministerial statement as co-sponsors, and more countries are expected. Now, what are some of those references? I mean, firstly, members have decided to intensify work on areas of common interest with a view to identifying actions that members could collectively take to support global efforts to reduce plastic pollution. And as you will see in the sections that I've underlined, a lot of them refer to plastic substitutes. There's a reference to expanding trade in environmentally sustainable and effective substitutes and alternatives, development of access to environmentally sustainable and effective substitutes and alternatives to single-use plastics, developing and strengthening local capacities to produce these substitutes. In addition, there's also a reference to aid for trade. So considering plastic pollution, environmentally sustainable plastics trade in aid for trade with environmentally sustainable objectives. There's a reference to work on standards, which are more for plastics, but they could also be relevant to plastic substitutes as well, with a specific reference to initiatives such as the ISO, the Basel Convention, and the new ongoing Global Plastics Treaty, which will be discussed at the UNEA-5. There's also reference to work on customs classification, improving the harmonized system, again on plastics, but I would argue that there's also a case to be made for extending this to plastic substitutes as well eventually. And finally, to hold dedicated discussions with a view to identifying best practices and sharing experiences, including regarding environmentally sustainable effective substitutes and alternatives, as well as identifying technologies for environmentally sustainable and effective substitutes and alternatives of interest to developing members and LDCs, including SIDS, which are especially vulnerable to marine litter and plastic pollution, and opportunities for the MSMEs. So as you can see that the statement provides a very clear roadmap for a work program ahead on plastic substitutes. And I think it would be great if developing countries pick up on this opportunity and engage more on how best they could look at ways of promoting plastic substitutes of interest to them, both at the WTO, but also looking at the other broader picture, which is essentially building capacity, access to technology, promoting the development dimension, etc. And with that, I'll end right now, but my colleague Henrique is going to follow up looking more specifically at the case of 3 countries, Bangladesh, Kenya, and Nigeria. And I think some of the big picture issues that I discussed today, you will get a more micro and granular level impact from Henrique in his presentation. So thank you all very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Mahesh. Really excellent presentation. And I was reluctant to intervene when the time was getting short because I really felt that it was really informative and useful. So great that you were so specific about which countries are existing producers in this area and where the opportunities might lie, and also some of the trade policy related constraints, and also where trade policy can make a difference here. So without taking more time, I'm going to turn directly to our three commentators. I'll start with Daniela, and hopefully you can help us put this work also in context of the work that you're helping to lead at the WTO on the informal dialogue on plastic pollution. Daniela.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Thank you to UNCTAD, and thank you, Tess, for this very kind invitation. Thank you, Mahesh. The presentation was excellent and very clear, and it really gives you a clear view of all the opportunities beyond the challenges we have to tackle plastic pollution. But certainly there is a lot of opportunities for small developing countries. Thank you, for the research, data, and solutions. As I mentioned, we believe that trade can be a solution and contribute to address this problematic on plastic pollution. And we need to identify challenges, but also the economic opportunities for developing countries to explore opportunities to support small, medium enterprises. And this can be done certainly by including, by supporting non-plastic substitutes, an alternative, and why not to explore the potential to identify export opportunities as well. As at the informal dialogue of plastics pollution and trade at the WTO, we have covered 6 topics. Many of them were mentioned when Mahesh did the presentation, and the importance related to substitutes, an alternative, improving transparency and monitoring trade trends, promoting best practices, strengthening policy coherence, identifying the scope for collective approaches, and assessing capacity and technical needs, technical assistance needs. Also, of course, cooperating with other international processes and efforts. When we talk about, and this was very clear in the presentation of Mahesh, and thank you again, when we talk about addressing trade-related capacity building and technical assistance, needs for developing members, in particular LDCs and vulnerable small island developing states, we have included one particular issue, expand trade in environmentally sustainable and effective substitutes and alternatives. Now, the tools and options and how we get to that, we have a very clear roadmap in terms of our declaration, but still we need to put to hold discussions, and certainly the stakeholders, UNCTAD and TESS expertise will be instrumental to advance on this. But just giving some idea on what the declaration and what our discussions came into conclude when we were talking about exploring the opportunities about training substitutes and alternative and sustainable and effective substitutes and alternatives. So encourage collaboration with the relevant stakeholders through inter alia, the exchange of knowledge and experience related to the development of and access to environmentally sustainable and effective, including cost and functionality effective. Cost was one of the things that were discussed during our dialogue. Substitutes, but also alternative to single-use plastics. The other thing was to develop and strengthen local capacities to produce environmentally sustainable and effective substitutes and alternative to single-use plastics, and of course through the facilitation, through facilitating access to key technologies, including innovative technologies. So transfer access to key technologies is a very important issue as well. So beyond the need for national regional studies and on potential market opportunities, financing, we need to make sure these products reach potential markets. And a very important point was made by Mahesh with the presentation. Tariff and non-tariff barriers are definitely issues to address when we talk about trade. And also packaging requirements, for example, there you have policy coherence, transparency, and visibility as important part of this equation, and the important areas where we need to find trade tools to to access markets and find opportunities for small developing countries. And even if the discussions can advance regionally or multilateral at the WTO, I think the IDP and that's where we can see the IDP as a platform in the WTO to engage with other organizations in terms of finding solutions. We need to also engage with the ISO, with the WCO, but also with the private sector and relevant stakeholders in different areas and topics. So I think I really thank the study from UNCTAD because it has done an amazing job in identifying concrete opportunities for a subset of countries, developing countries that some are already part of the IDP, and we hope some others will join soon, because we need to see trade not only as part of the problem, but also as part of the solution. And just to mention about our conversations when we had our dialogue in June about collective approaches and cooperation in terms of how trade can contribute to tackle plastic pollution, we had a very important experience shared from the Latin American Integration Association. They mentioned two rounds of trade discussions. We call those business rounds that were relevant in 2021 to address plastic pollution in the region. And they called these rounds creative industries and information and digital technologies in terms of how we move to a more sustainable trade. So within Latin America, they focus their rounds, these business rounds, in how to address opportunities in terms of substitutes. But also other countries, for example, SIDS have brought this to the discussion, how plant and animal fiber value chains can support to this issue, and how we can better support SMEs to reach markets and economies of scales. Anyways, I won't talk more about this issue, but we certainly thank you. We certainly thank UNCTAD and TESS, and ready to engage in with any country that would like to know more about the informal dialogue on plastics, pollution and trade. And certainly thank you, Caroline, again, and Enrique, David, and Mahesh.
Great, thank you so much, Daniela, and thank you also for your endorsement that this work is really useful for developing country governments and the governments that you're working with in the IDP process. I'm sure that that's the underlying motivation for both UNCTAD and TESS, is to make sure that we're producing work that is useful and can support countries in their efforts to reduce plastic pollution. So I'm going to turn now to Alice Tipping, who's also been a really valuable analyst and thinker behind the scenes in working through ways that we can use trade policy to support reduce plastic pollution. And so I'd like to turn to Alice now from IASD. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Carolyn, and thank you very much to TESS and to UNCTAD for the invitation to join this roundtable. As Caroline says, we've been following the plastics debate for some time and working on some pieces of analysis that have gone into the discussion so far. So the report that Carolyn and Mahesh have already spoken to and Daniela's talked about, I think I've been lucky enough to see part of an executive summary, and I think it's a really useful piece of analysis. So I do encourage you to spend some time, perhaps over your Christmas holiday, reading it when it comes out, or in January, because I think it's a really useful input to the policy discussion. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the report, and some of the pieces of the analysis have been highlighted already, but I'll talk about why I think it's a useful piece of analysis, and then I'll come back to some of the trade points that Mahesh was talking about in his presentation. I suppose the first question, though, is why is it important to talk about plastic substitutes, right? Why do plastic substitutes really matter? And at least as I see it, and it's kind of is ideas born of discussions I've had over the last few days as well, is that they really are key to the transition that governments want to undertake, right? I mean, plastic is so successful precisely because it meets many of our needs very well, right? The need to hold and transport food and drink, the need to package and protect things we don't want broken, the need to create things, buildings and lighting systems and TVs and my iPhone. So if we don't have a substitute that we can use instead of plastic, it becomes very difficult for governments and consumers to simply do without things that we've become accustomed to having, right? So it's a crucial part of the political and the policy work that needs to be done to address a global economy that's already awash with plastic. So I think the report is really useful in advancing the discussion on plastic substitutes for a number of reasons. And the first is that it focuses on 3 developing countries, as Carolyn was saying at the beginning, Bangladesh, Kenya, and Nigeria, where plastic is an important part of the waste stream. I was reading in the report, it's around 12% in Kenya's case. And the focus on developing countries, I think, matters because solutions for developing countries aren't going to have the luxury of having lots of financial and lots of human resources devoted to them. And because I think there's a particular argument in the developing country case for having homegrown solutions, right? Homegrown substitutes that contribute to other imperative development objectives like employment in particular. So I think the focus on those 3 countries makes a lot of sense and they're well chosen. Secondly, the report takes a sort of a life cycle analysis approach, and Mahesh was referring to this briefly at the beginning, and this is, I'm sure, something that we'll get into in the later presentations. And I think that's important because it forces us as policy makers and policy thinkers to look not just at the potential benefits in terms of reduced plastic use, but also at the trade-offs of environmental impacts across both the life cycle of plastic production and the life cycle of its alternative, right? So what this leads to, I think, is important findings that put in a holistic context the different policy choices that policymakers, or the different choices, I suppose, that are embedded in the options that the report talks about. And I think that matters because it gives policymakers a clear view of what they might have to trade off, right, in terms of other environmental impacts if they want to incentivize a shift to alternatives. And I think it's important that we don't shy away from understanding those trade-offs, right? That the knowledge of them means that policymakers and the politicians know where they're going and can defend policy decisions if resistance to them emerges, as it often does. So I think the kind of the holistic approach and a very cool-headed sense of what we're trading off and why, what we're trading off makes sense because it then allows policymakers to decide what trade-offs they want to undertake and why. And the last reason I think the report is a useful piece of analysis is that it then applies this techno-economic assessment of alternatives. And this is something Mahesh mentioned in one of his slides, right? So the question, the report asks the question of, can the feasible alternatives actually be produced domestically? And how much can they really displace the plastic that's currently used? And so that gives us, I think, a really clear view of the possibilities for using domestically produced paper in Nigeria, or jute bags in Bangladesh, or glass in all 3 countries. And that again is an important piece of the puzzle for policymakers, right? So, you know, not just this would be nice to do, but what am I really trading off, and how much impact could that change actually achieve in my economy, and what else do I need to do in terms of flanking policies to make sure that the shift to the substitute that I would like to shift to, you know, actually has an impact and actually achieves the results I want. So I think the design of the report is really interesting because it gives you that clear-sighted view of the substitutes and the possibilities. And the trade policy analysis, which is what Mahesh was talking to, is also really interesting. And it throws up, I think, some quite important questions, right? So, you know, if you are, what does your tariff profile look like, right? Kind of where a lot of trade policy starts. You know, do you have much lower tariffs on plastic feedstocks than you do on natural product feedstocks? And what are you trading off there? Are you perhaps making it even more difficult for some of your natural product producers to get off the ground, right, and compete against plastic, you know, plastic products driven by those cheaper feedstocks? So, you know, so there's an interesting tariff question there, and so there's obviously sort of an initial question about how can we use tariffs and other forms of trade regulation to expand the domestic market, our own market, for an alternative, if that's where we want to shift. But and Mahesh was talking to this as well, it's also, I think, about expanding the global market, for your alternative, be it a jute bag or be it, paper bags. And so there's an important idea in the report about expanding preferential trade agreements with large developing countries, right, beyond the developed countries that currently provide them. The idea, I think, being that it's important not just to create a larger domestic market for your alternative, but if you can create a larger global market for the alternative, the good that you want to promote, you enable production of that alternative at scale, right, which makes it cheaper everywhere. But there are also a couple of other important things that need to be considered if you want to make that global market for your alternative really work. And the paper talks about them, right? It talks about the need to ensure that the standards applied to the production of that alternative are accessible, so that developing country producers can use those standards to service the market that you've created with your expanded preferential scheme, for example. And Mahesh spoke to this, right? Including, thinking about the requirements around the use of plastic in packaging for fresh products, the example of the use of pesticides and natural fiber products, right? Are the standards applied to your newly large market for your alternative, are they really accessible? Do they work? And the second part of it is that it is useful to have HS codes that are detailed enough to show us how much of this substitute, how much of this alternative is actually being traded. And that I've always thought is important, because you want to understand where demand is being met, and also to see where trade isn't happening, where you might expect it to happen, right? So then you can dig into perhaps why isn't it happening, right? Why is the market not working the way I thought it might when I changed my policy levers in this following direction? So I think there are good ideas in the report about how that could be done. And I think it's a useful report that combines both very sort of practical, cool-headed policy advice and examples of how specific kinds of policies can be tweaked to encourage particular alternatives and substitutes, and a useful piece of trade policy advice as well, right? Because it links together. That's it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alice, and a great review, and so happy that the report is so useful. I have been not such a good moderator today because I'm not keeping everyone to time. So I promised David that we'll be done in 5 minutes. Meanwhile, there are some questions in the chat, Mahesh. So I would suggest that maybe you could just reply to them in the chat directly, because we won't have time for the Q&A at this point. But what I will do is turn directly to Arpit, please, for your reflections.
Thank you, Carolyn, and pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, everybody. So I basically wear 2 hats, one being a circular economy and a trade professional, and being managing the packaging business of the family. I mean, it's easier said than done, to be very honest. When I used to be on the other side alone, and I used to think about it, it was improving the standards. All of that is very looks very easy, but it's very difficult. And I'll give you a very few practical challenges we are facing. First of all, when we look at single-use plastics, there is not enough research that has happened when it comes to food contamination and the newer materials that are coming in. Plastics has been there for several decades, and there has been enough research that especially polypropylene has been very good and safe for consumption of baby products or our food packaging. So there's a lot of issue with respect to standards that is there. For instance, we went to the Indian government and told them that we want to include recycled plastics in our food packaging. And we were told we're not allowed to do that because it's completely banned to do it. There is no research that's there. So definitely, like Mahesh had pointed out, standards need to be quickly adapted to, and technology and standards have to move together to move forward in this transition. Another major thing which I see is that when we move to alternative materials, we must not abuse them for sure. I mean, when we were using paper, we moved to plastics because paper was causing a lot of deforestation, and plastic initially was very good. We were reusing it again and again, but we then messed it up. So we cannot do that for the newer materials. So I think the major issue rather than just the alternative material is to kind of disrupt the take, make, dispose model, which is the key to it. When it comes to cost implications on moving to alternative materials, we often see the discussion focuses on what is the cost of the material per se per kilogram. That obviously reduces down when there is economies of scale. I think the major and the larger issue is the investment that has gone into fixed assets of an industry of when using plastics. I'll give you an example. We imported German machinery, injection molding machinery and robots 3 years ago. An average lifespan of these machineries around 20 years. And now there's the new alternative materials are coming in. We are very scared if the new machinery and the new machines would they be able to be utilized in this new packaging which we are going to develop. So I think the transition for the industry, while ensuring that they can use their existing infrastructure and assets, is something that is very important when we talk about technology and innovation. When it comes to would we like to import alternative packaging material from abroad? I mean, India being a big manufacturer of plastic resins, we still need to do it because the grade I want is not manufactured in India. So we import it from Dubai. Ideally, we do not want to import. Like Alice said, it's easier to buy local. And considering COVID has actually taught us that the supply chains can be disrupted anytime, and we would ideally want to buy it locally. But there are several challenges to it. And the challenges are, I would for instance, I'll show you my packaging and just quickly do it. Initially, what we used to do is we used to have this material made of HDPE, and the label out of it was made of LDPE. Now we moved to the packaging being polypropylene and the label being polypropylene as a single monomaterial. So we moved, so it was easier for recycling to happen. Now we want to move a little ahead. On the top of it, we have aluminum packaging, which has poly in it because it helps in sealing. We want to move away from that for two reasons. One is obviously environment reason. The other is major reason is economics. Aluminum is very expensive at this moment, and we don't want to proceed with that. So we approached some of the alternative suppliers in India. They could not help us out. So we approached somebody again in Germany, and they gave us this. This is a paper kind of a material, which can also be sealed on top, which is not the usual paper quality. It is a patented technology. Now, the cost of this is more expensive than the whole packaging bottle. So I could not proceed with that. Next, we went to China. They did amazing reverse engineering and were ready to provide us with this. But then the trade tensions between India and China did not allow us to move to buy it from there. So now we are exploring newer opportunities for this. So there are definitely these kind of challenges that are there, but we're positive and confident that we'll make it something that happen. Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't have my unmute. Thank you so much, Arpit. And so interesting to have a very concrete example from India. I mean, your focus was more on the use of sort of alternative plastics or to try and redesign plastic products. But I think that alongside this emphasis on plastic substitutes, that's something that's also going to have to be part of the solution mix. And as you say, using more recycled content when we can, and reducing the range of materials in a single product to facilitate their recyclability. So that's really key. But I really thought what was interesting, which would be great to discuss further another time, is your emphasis on how the trade policy frameworks and wider landscape was affecting your capacity to shift in the direction you wanted. And also, I think critically, this issue of access to technology at an affordable price. And so I think here, I know that one of the issues that in the IDP, the governments will be discussing is looking around issues of how do you access affordable and appropriate technologies or be able to adapt them to local circumstances and needs. And so I think here there are issues obviously around licensing and technology transfer and also intellectual property issues, as well as Mahesh mentioned around financing. And so I think it's really great actually that we had your practical example at the end of how all these somewhat sometimes can seem abstract policy discussions actually play out in a really in a specific case. So I fear that we won't have time to do questions as such, but Mahesh, could I offer you 1 minute at the end just to wrap up with any reflections that you have on the comments from our colleagues here? Yeah.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Yes, sorry. Sorry, I just quickly wrap up. No, I think I was just responding to some of the questions in the chat. I think they're really interesting questions. And I think one, maybe three, couple of points I might want to just sort of take away is that firstly, the issue needs a lot more work. So we do need to have a lot more analysis of some of the issues and what kind of substitutes are out there, what kind of barriers do developing countries face. I mean, as there was one question from Ron, which I was looking at where, I mean, the environmental impacts definitely differ according to the material that we are looking at. So we really need to carefully consider what exactly, which material we should be considering. But finally, I would say that there is a lot of opportunity for trade. And I think it's that we're really at the surface. I mean, there's a lot more exploring to do and a lot more, I would say maybe it might be good for countries to sort of go back, introspect domestically as to maybe what kind of potential feedstocks that they might have in their economy that could be worth tapping into, and then sort of looking at that and pushing that at the global scale in markets. So there's a lot of work to be done, I think, both at the domestic level for identification of substitutes, for the development of the regulatory structure and the incentive framework, and finally on looking at what are the trade opportunities and trade policy actions that can be pursued. So I'll wrap it up there.
Great. Thank you so much, Mahesh. And thank you also to Arpit and to Daniela and to Alice, each of you for really adding value, I think, to Mahesh's presentation by zooming in on some of the opportunities, the political perspectives, some of the trade-offs and tensions at hand that Alice raised, and also some of the practical challenges and also opportunities that Arpit put forward for us. So I think that this session has been an optimistic one, but there's definitely scope for more work and analysis in this area. And the reason that's worth doing is because there's a chance to make a real difference to plastic pollution by promoting plastic substitutes, and also to make a difference to developing countries in terms of generating and supporting local communities, local employment, and industrial development in countries themselves. So all around, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. And now I will turn to David Vivas to take you through the second part of this seminar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline, and thank you very much for all the speakers of the previous session. It has been very interesting. Now we're going to the panel 2 session, which title is Promoting Competitive and Manageable Material Substitutes in Developing Countries. So here we're zooming in. Some points that are important before we get into the session is that identifying substitutes and alternatives is a moving target. There are many that are being identified as we advance, and we are contrasting them against life cycle analysis, but there might be others that could come in, and just mentioned by Daniela this afternoon, the issue of animal fibers, which also have potential. So it's the term substitutes need to be understood in a dynamic way. It's going to be subject to many changes, including technology, life cycle analysis, recyclability, and many other aspects. I like to remind that this is an event organized by UNTAC and TESS. I've been asked by the Geneva Environmental Network to also mention that there is a series of events called Beating the Plastic Pollution, and the next one will be on plastics in the mountain systems and ecosystems. So please also participate in that one. Now I'm going to give the floor to my colleague Enrique, who is going to really bring you to the analysis we have done on a basket of plastic substitutes, and then the economics in terms of production and potential. Enrique, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, but put it in presentation mode, please.
Perfect. Well, thanks again. It was very enriching to see the first panel and also the trade angles related to this transmaterialization, so the big transition that we want to have. It's nice to see this in perspective. Up to 1860, the world ran not on plastics, but on natural and mineral materials. And I think it will run again on those materials very soon. So we are in the anomaly phase where we have to deal with this issue as a pollution issue through a better systems design. So this presentation is also based on the work that has been done together with the Graduate Institute and TESS on material substitutes as part of the SMEP program, which is supported by UK aid. I'll not go very deep into the rationale of why transmaterializing, so why using substitute materials is important, because it has been properly explained by Mahesh. But there's a large potential there. It's not only a cost, but it's a potential window towards new productive capacities and new value addition. And also it matches well with the pursuit of zero carbon growth. So living more with the resources we have on Earth's surface and relying less on fossil inputs. I'll go straight to the options here. Mahesh already briefed some of the potentials. I'm more grounded here in the country cases that we explored in the upcoming study. I've seen some questions about when this study will be out. UNCTAD will publish this study probably in January, the full report. Some of the speakers already got an executive summary, so this is why some made comments on it, especially Alice. But there will be a public version very available very soon for all to read. The analysis is much more developed there. So alternatives, which are the alternatives we're talking about? I mean, looking at simple things, so that create big problems, like especially complex, especially complicated single-use plastics like grocery bags or plates or straws. For every country, there is always one option or more than one option that can be used, like jute, paper, cotton bags, bamboo materials, a lot of processed agricultural residues. But there's one bad boy in the neighborhood: sachets. Sachets have no good viable alternative. And if we think in hindsight, we didn't use sachets before. It's a invention of the 20th century, a sad one, which has a high cumulative effect, and we actually don't need sachets to live. Sachets is an example of why the substitution effect is not enough on its own. You need to have a different system that uses less single-use items because they're not really necessary. The life cycle analysis component, which is going to come in the study in more details, is very important because, as Alice Tipping said, we need to look at the trade-offs. If we are changing A for B, we need to make sure that B delivers better environmental and social performance than A. So let's look at this example here for Bangladesh, looking at different types of bag alternatives. And we ran a life cycle analysis together with an Austrian group to check for each alternative bag what will be the life cycle impact compared to the baseline. So we saw that one of the critical one here is a cotton bag. Cotton bag has a high environmental impact in all categories observed, such as freshwater eutrophication, marine eutrophication, carcinogenic effects, because cotton bags come from the agriculture upstream, and growing cotton is an expensive energetically and environmentally endeavor. So we'd better make sure that the cotton bags are reused many times over and over again, and not only replace single-use plastics and become a single-use plastic cotton bag. That would make no sense. This is there are many categories here. We did that for different types of products, but this just shows how impactful the alternative can be on the environment through LC analysis as well. If we look at the similar analysis for Nigeria, we can, as previously mentioned, look at animal fibers. So we have wool bags here that have also a high environmental impact, considering its life cycle. Together with cotton bags, wool bags are an alternative we should watch out for. We should make sure that they are really reused many times, so that their environmental impacts are spread along the life of the product, hopefully a very long life of the product, and not only being purchased, used once from the grocery to home, and then shelved. That will be not a very good material transition. But this type of analysis, so understanding the trade-off, understanding where we are getting to, is very important for both at the international multilateral level, so to support negotiations such as WTO, IDP, the World Customs Organizations, and others, but also at the national level to know what you're getting into in terms of trade-off choices. The export profiles of those products, especially the materials and the end-use products, also tells an interesting story. If we look at on the left side here, we're looking at plastic and non-plastic feedstocks, so the materials used to make things. And we see that the main important thing is to look at these orange bars. They represent net exports. So if net exports are negative, means that the country has a debt. The country is importing overall those materials. So you see that there's a systemic net imports of plastics materials in the case of Bangladesh here, and also most occasions also a systemic imports, a net imports of alternative materials. So you see that this is a game that requires trade. So most of those feedstocks are coming in from abroad and are being processed into other products. The other side here on the right side, you have a view of the end-use products. And the story is similar, except for jutes and some specific materials that have high production. In the case of Bangladesh, most other materials are still, for packaging, are still mostly imported. So that's an important thing to take into account when promoting a substitute. There's a similar dynamic here for Kenya, another case study that we examined into the upcoming report. Most plastic materials are imported overall, and so are the alternative materials. And we can say the same for end-use products, which are here with this lower right area here. You can have an idea that, for example, aluminum boxes or glass bottles, they are still overall subject to net imports. So that's an important question for the national authorities. Cost issues. The report also looks at some issues related to costs. As Arpit said, things need to be price attractive to take place. And this report surveyed the price of simple items like paper bags and plastic bags or cups or plates in the markets of Bangladesh and the markets of Kenya. In Bangladesh, the price of plastics was generally lower than the price of the alternative. So plastics were hard to compete with. And I got the feeling myself that, oh my God, the plastic is going to be cheaper everywhere. So hard to tilt this equation. Not really. In Kenya, we saw that the price of plastics and the substitutes were on a similar level. So there was not such a price difference. The ranges were overlapping. So that is to say, of course, the scale of production of plastic bags or plastic straws is much higher than the scale of production of alternative bags and straws. So this can be adjusted perhaps as if scales approach each other, or if the scales of the alternatives grow past a certain point to become price competitive. Perhaps one way to do that is to act on public procurement. The government purchasing power has the capacity to create enough purchase or enough market scale so that the prices of the alternatives shrink. Another thing I wanted to say, those are a bit pieces of information, but I think they all relate to the transmaterialization challenge, is the size of the problem. This is a slide plagiarized from my colleague Davi, and we looked at the overall size of plastics markets, intermediate forms, plastic goods, plastics, textiles, like polyester in the world. And I don't know if I've got the sense that when we talk about material alternatives, we mostly talk about packaging, about single-use items, and that's a small part of the entire materials universe of plastics. So $53 billion compared to $1 trillion of overall plastics usage. That is to say that we might not achieve healthier oceans or better material systems by transmaterialization alone. We need other actions. Perhaps Terry, one of the commentators, can also develop that will reduce overall usage of plastics and non-materials overall. Okay, so better systems design. We cannot use the alternatives or the substitutes the same way we use plastics today. I'm approaching the end of the presentation. This is a a slide that shows that precision is necessary. If you want to legislate anything on plastics alternatives or play with tariffs up or down, you need to have precise HS codes that are identifying what is plastics, what is the alternative for each category here. And the upcoming report, and there's a fact sheet that we prepared, which can also be sent to the participants, shows that, well, there's a whole process ongoing at the World Customs Organization to update the HS codes as Mahesh presented. But this is very, very, very important. You cannot legislate, you cannot do policy, you cannot regulate, but you cannot measure. That's almost a rule in the public sector. Finally, we have the issue of where are we getting into? Can we handle the trade-offs? Can we handle the downstream? If we change plastics for crop residues or for agricultural organic-based materials, or glass, or mineral products, or paper, or clay, can we handle crop residues better than we handle plastics? Can we handle clay better than we handle plastics? And together with some colleagues from the SMEP program and UNCTAD, we plotted this small investigation here, looking at many policy documents from a few countries, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Nepal, and Kenya. We tried to dig out the recovery capacity for different types of materials that act as substitutes to plastics. And we calculated the review comparative advantage of them as an idea of how competitive they are or they could be in a specific country. So we noticed that most countries they struggle to have a high recovery recycling rate for materials other than plastics. And we also see that the materials which are highly recovered is the usual suspect. Aluminium is very highly priced. People pick it and recover it, but they are often not very competitive or imported or reliant on high value addition industries that are often abroad. So it's quite a challenge. Ideally, you want to have the plastics substitutes in this area here where it's both competitive and you have a good downstream management. So you have good waste management or end of life management of the alternative residue. Finally, to close, in order to keep some questions for discussion for the commentators here, we should look at the trade-offs. We should look at the alternatives as a new road that we are taking. So, and how to look at that, I think one of the best ways to look at life cycle analysis of the alternative. Hey, we need to look at system designs change, not only changing the material, that will not solve the problem, and work with precise HS codes to have focused target action areas for tariff liberalization and stimulus. We also should look at the downstream, should look at what type of recovery and recycling capacities we have at hand for the alternatives. Should look at cost and competitiveness, why in some cases the cost of the alternative or the substitutes is higher than the cost of plastics. What can we do to address it? Perhaps public procurement can be one of the ways. Others. Yeah. And or working through regional blocks to increase the scale of markets, not only limited to national markets. And finally, we also see that the challenge of shifting materials is a challenge of value addition. We need to keep promoting productive capacity so that countries can develop a level of value addition and transform whatever alternative or substitute material they have at hand into end-use products, which are actually the things people use and the things that go to the economic system. I'll stop here. David just mentioned that again, that we have the full study out in January, which was produced in cooperation with the Graduate Institute and with the SMAP program funded by UK FCDO. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Enrique. I think there are many points coming from your presentation. One important one is that substitution is only one part of a larger solution, where you need also to reduce, and recycle, as has been mentioned by many. So it's just a contribution. The other angle that I think is very important is that when you're talking about substitutes, you're talking about a circular, sustainable industrial policy, which is important because you're trying to change the way we produce and consume and offer alternatives in the market that can be sooner than later. That's another important message. Substitutes that have been mentioned are already available and could be scaled up in a relatively short period of time. in many countries. So that's perhaps one of the main features of substitutes over other policies, because just bringing recycling to all developing countries in the next 20 years is going to take a little bit of effort to really scale up, and implies a lot of investments. Well, substitutes could be spearhead by the private sector with support of the governments. Now we have three fantastic commentators. Number one will be Mr. Debabrata Chakraborty. I hope I pronounced it well, who is counselor at the Permanent Mission of Bangladesh. We have listened to Bangladesh a lot today, special relation to youth, and you have an important supply side and value addition capacity in this case. Coming from Latin America, we always get the youth bags for cocoa and coffee from Bangladesh, so we are an important user of these materials. Debabrata, please welcome and your comments.
Thank you. Thank you, all colleagues. I shouldn't attribute separately, but really grateful for this invitation. Colleagues from UNCTAD, SMAP, UKAID, and TESS. I also thank colleagues David and Enric for his fabulous presentation. I should say that it captures well. It's a good case study. At least a good beginning, I should say, the way it has dealt detail. Of course, we are very much looking forward to the study in detail, although we just received just the executive summary of promoting competitiveness and manageable material substitute in developing countries. And of course, David, you are right that like Bangladesh, many countries are producing substitute, but the most important part is whether they are competitive. And I think if you ask me what is the crux of the jewel of this study, I should tell that this revelation of this techno-economic assessment that shows, particularly in these three countries, including my own country, Bangladesh, that for some materials, the domestic industry is simply not ready to produce the products required as a scale that enable a shift away from existing products. So although we have identified some substitutes that we have, but simply the domestic industry is not ready, and there are different reasons. And I think in the next series of studies, next series of researches, those issues should be also focused, of course. And I take your point that you have repeated that substitution is only one part of the solution, but of course there are many. Of course, if we just go to Bangladesh, of course, the role of tariff and everything that has been covered in this study are quite, of course, important. But particularly, of course, the two ways we earlier marked, and the study also highlighted that tariff measures plus other regulatory measures. I can tell you a little bit of very recent development during the last couple of months in Bangladesh under the order of our Supreme Court. So there is now a new coastal area plan to use of sustainable use of single plastic, or single use of plastics, better to say, because it is a hazard, and the court has asked the government to put policy in place, and it has just put only last month. So 12 districts of the coastal area are now under that plan, and they are supposed to take some concrete measures and report back to the Supreme Court within next 3 years. So this is the kind of defined time period that a court has given and the government has started working on. So this is one piece of information, particularly from Bangladesh. We also have one action plan on sustainable use of plastics. So that is that also is basically done under the solid waste management rules of 2021 that has been just finalized only last week. So this is just most recent, and this has inscribed the use of biodegradable plastic bags for disposing waste for household and both for the small industries. Also, it has put annual reporting system on plastic recycling by all producers and importers of plastics. There is also a separate section on the single use of plastics in the annual reporting. And it has also included this extended producer responsibility of EPR that both Mahesh and Enric has pointed out in their reports. And of course, it has included the life cycle analysis of plastic. So these are the pretty recent initiatives of the government, but I know that regulation is regulation, they need to be promulgated. And we all know that the Jute Act, and this report has also pointed out this, the Jute Act of 2021 pointed out, and it has made compulsory for all producers of 6 essential items for production and distribution, like paddy, rice, wheat, maize, fertilizer, and sugar. They should use jute bags or jute bag covers as compulsory thing. And our crops plan, that is the major plan document for Bangladesh government, and now the 8th 5-year plan, which will continue from 2021 to 2026, that has also emphasized the phasing out of this SUPS. So these are something, but I have also a question on these, and I know that time is very short, but when I compare the data in this report, particularly this executive summary of these case studies and the UNCTAD report, that for Bangladesh, they have used 2015. I know that the availability of data is a question, but for Kenya and Nigeria, they have used that from 2019. So I've just questioned whether this data is so scarce for Bangladesh. Now, of course, jute, which of course, David, you have also pointed out, we have in Bangladesh comparative advantage, but also there is a new innovation that is garments or ready-made garments with cotton, what is called jute, is pronounced, sounds similar. So it's not, jute means in Bengali language, not the real one. That means it looks like jute, but not jute. So it's jute. So it's basically remnants of the garments, and they are assembled and made for the paper sack or thread sacks like that. Another important thing that I must want to say, particularly from Bangladesh, that COVID-19 has increased the use of single-use of plastics. I'm not quite sure whether this is the case in other countries, but I think in the next version of study or revision, this issue can be taken care of. This is an important aspect. The report that I'm hearing from my colleagues in Bangladesh that, of course, after the pandemic, the single use of plastic has been increased, particularly in different formats and covers of different therapeutics and others. Well, on the other substitutes like use of paper, cups, and plates, so I'm not quite sure how much pressure we are creating on trees, but this is quite important, as we have written in our note, that from taking care of one ingredient of pollution, are we suppressing any other area, particularly whether this use of plastic cups, if not paper cups, if not from the recycled paper, it will be resulting in deforestation. And I think, like Bangladesh, for many countries, it will be a big cost, a big price. So enough has been told about jute. Of course, Bangladesh is ready with jute, but one question is there, we don't have right kind of R&D, or enough, I should say, we don't have enough R&D technology, and there is no scale up of that. The recent example is one, Dr. Mubarak's innovative idea on from jute byproducts, shopping bag. So this is really biodegradable, and I was in charge of an institution before coming to Geneva, and I have personally examined that within a couple of weeks, this is just soluble to water. So this is a very good initiative, but there are many initiatives like that from jute or any other agriculture byproducts, but developing countries need support for that. And food safety is also another concern. If we go too much of the agriculture for many countries, whether are we exchanging or putting food safety in severity in exchange of single use of plastic. So that is another area where I think more light should be focused. Colleagues, I also want to point out another important UN resolution that was passed in 21st November 2091, that says resolution on natural plant fibers. This is the UN resolution for common that calls upon the governments to mainstream the promotion of the natural fibers into their policies, plans, and laws. I think this is a time to call all, at least to utilize this. In UNCTAD's work, we can utilize this as well for other areas as well. So this is, of course, an internationally agreed document. On aluminum as substitute, as Mahesh and both Henrik has pointed out, of course, this is a good substitute, but I have a question once again, because the reports I have read, not only from Bangladesh, but also from some other developing countries, that aluminum cans might indeed means less ocean waste, but they come with their own eco price. The production of each can pumps about twice as much carbon into atmosphere as each plastic bottle. Now, how then it's a good substitute to save, or are we going to pollute the earth, either to save land, or, I mean, what is the cost to save land in the cost of price of air. So that's the common question. But I think this is not the question from Bangladesh only. From many other countries, people will be asking this question. So for priority setting, this is another aspect that our colleagues in UNCTAD and SEP can think over. That in many developing countries, and LDCs particularly, there are many challenges, and among those challenges, there are different competitive sectors that dominate, and single use of plastic or its substitute measures may lag behind. So how more policy space could be promoted there? That's a big question and a big challenge in many of our countries as well. So if I may come towards almost conclusion for this, it's really encouraging that UNCTAD and colleagues are doing this thing. But as you know, that in many developing countries like LDCs are included, we have unique challenges. And of course, we have limited resources and comparatively for bigger population. We also have limited implementation capacity. So what is minimum environmental standard, as many colleagues have pointed out today, and its compliance in one country may be out of the capacity in low-income countries. And as they do not have viable technological base, if the environmentally friendly industrial goods are too costly, the LDC simply cannot afford those. I mean, of course, I indicate this life cycle analysis as well, because for those you need heavy industrial support as well. And of course, for developing
can we wrap up, because we have other two commentators and time is running.
My final point would be that appropriate technology must be supported to the LDCs, particularly after TRIP 66.2, plus this SDG 17.7 that of course calls for environmentally sound technology for developing countries. And we must look for the implementation of those commitments as well. So with that, I once again thank you. It's a fabulous roundtable, I should say, and we should continue this sort of discussion. I thank you all.
Thank you very much for the useful comments, interesting from the point of view of Bangladesh. Very, very relevant comments. I like the point on the marine protected areas. I also work on the Oceans Program as a also complementary measure. The importance of an action plan on plastics. This is something that the UN can help. There is not a standard or a unique framework to do that. And a point in general to many of your questions is there is no perfect material. You know, all materials have an environmental cost unless they are services. So we cannot deliver and consume food and many products through e-commerce. We need to always use some sort of material, and there are some better than others. And that's what we're trying to do here, trying to identify which could be the better ones. And again, that question will change, the answer to that question will change with time and with technology. You know, because it's not, it's a moving target. I'm going to leave now the floor to Mr. George Richards, who is a counselor and senior technical specialist at the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. He represents 9 countries, all very active in the front of fighting against plastic pollution and single-use plastics. They have a different experience. They are working a lot on oceans economy, on blue biotrade, including the use of seaweeds as potential elements, bagasse, and other agricultural waste that they have in the region to try to find a transition toward lower plastic economy. Joel, welcome. You're a good friend of ONTAG and TESS. Welcome to this event.
Thank you very much, David. And very pleased to be part of this roundtable discussion. And let me thank the previous panel and commenters, as well as the current panel. Thanks to Henrique in particular for what was certainly an excellent and balanced analysis, and Dev, who also brought some considerable balance to our conversation. As you rightly said, David, I'm representing the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. And to date, we have many Caribbean countries, including 4 of the OECS member states, which would be Antigua and Barbuda, Grenada, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, that have all placed a ban on the use and import of single-use plastics and styrofoam. The improper disposal of plastics continues to harm marine life, underwater ecosystems, and of course, the climate. According to the United Nations Environment Programme, the Caribbean Sea is the second most plastic contaminated sea in the world after the Mediterranean Sea. UNEP estimates that 600 to over 1,400 plastic items per square kilometer end up in the Caribbean Sea. And it's really against this background that I commend the organizers for today's roundtable session, as well as both UNCTAD and SMEP for the studies and the reports. I am certainly pleased to be part of this conversation, as I said before, but I'm also hoping that in the very near future, that this important body of work can benefit from empirical inputs from the Caribbean, given our more systemic interest in the area of plastics pollution as well. I want to focus my brief intervention on the challenges from an economic and policy perspective of material substitution in small countries like ours in the OECS that have limited productive capacities. And the first point I really want to make, and some of what I'll be saying also came out in what some of the previous speakers said, and I will attempt to elaborate as efficiently as I can. But the first point I want to raise is with respect to the need for efficient policy management. And any kind of policy change typically requires strategies for responding to unintended consequences of that policy. And this often needs to come through some form of compensating variation. And it's really in that context we have to also look at the whole issue of transitioning away from plastics and how we go about in terms of incorporating substitutes into our everyday lives. Now, policymakers must be in a position to anticipate the adjustment strategies of firms as those firms seek to minimize costs while also sustaining market share. And that is usually the tension, and it's been the tension that a number of our firms have had to face, especially firms that are involved in the production of plastics and plastic materials. It's really about how do we minimize cost, how do we transition, but how do we also maintain market share in that context. Now, in some Caribbean countries already, the majority of our supermarkets, for example, have initiated adjustments through initiatives to replace single-use plastics with reusable shopping bags, for example. Many restaurants have also begun adjustments to the use of more biodegradable food service materials. Some governments have also proposed fiscal adjustments to encourage private sector investment in the domestic production of alternatives to single-use plastics and have generally adopted a phased approach to implementation. And this phased approach is certainly important in a context where you need to give the private sector sufficient time to make the adjustments that they're being called on to make. It is also very important to consider strategies for rewarding potential losses for businesses, which might not be able to fully adjust to the new policy requirements over the short term. This is very important since revised policy could force some firms to either radically alter their operation strategy, where that is possible, or to ultimately cease operations. And again, this is another tension that tends to take place in markets such as ours, especially very, very small markets. The second issue I want to mention relates to how policy implementation tends to have different impacts on different sectors and industries. So for example, transitioning to other types of packaging can result in other costs for firms, which could result in even more substantial costs to some business entities. One such possibility is with respect to increased post-harvest losses to vegetable market operators, if we use that example in the context of the farming sector. For example, if single-use plastic replacements do not provide the same shelf life longevity as currently utilized plastic products do, then that creates sort of a difficulty for persons who are in those types of industries. A similar dynamic could also emerge, particularly in the case of persons who are in the food service industry, restaurants, supermarkets, catering, and they tend to face added costs to meet new or different food safety or public health requirements consequent upon the adoption of alternatives to single-use packaging. I want to in particular highlight the printing and packaging subsector because we do have some limited production in our jurisdictions where this subsector is concerned. And what we've seen is that it has faced a significant short-term reduction in current output demand with potential for substantial financial losses, because the requirement has been that where there's a ban on single-use plastics, then you need to phase out all of your current production. And that with that comes a significant amount of financial losses. And this then brings into perspective the whole idea of the additional social ramifications in the form of job losses, the implications of the need for transition support to sectors negatively affected so that they could possibly become viable players in the production of environmentally friendly alternatives to single-use plastics in the future. The third point I will make, and very quickly, David, is that there are unaccounted costs of single-use plastics which may also accrue outside of the firm. And these externality costs include environmental impacts such as flooding due to the accumulations of single-use plastics in water courses. There are public health impacts related to bioaccumulation of microplastics in the food chain and release threats to wildlife and marine fauna. And of course, the despoiling of beaches and other recreational areas. The mitigation costs of at least some of these additional costs should also be taken into account in any kind of cost-benefit analysis and scenarios in order to fully assess the full impact of any proposed policies. Now, the application of an enhanced single-use plastic strategy is likely to be maximally efficient if it is accompanied by a much more comprehensive and robust national waste management program, which builds more efficient institutions, strengthens the waste management regulatory framework, and improves waste management incentives. This is important since in the absence of more rigorous waste management regime, even the disposal of alternatives could in turn become the source of additional externality costs to the economy. And I think Enrique did allude to some of, I think, what he referred to as the need for better systems, also to reduce the environmental impact of some of the alternatives. And this point I just made, I think, fits really into that context very, very neatly. The fifth point I will make, and penultimate point, is that there's a need for a more finely attuned fiscal incentive framework in developing countries across the board, which could stimulate the strengthening of the overall circular economy. Now, coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, where many of our governments are facing with serious fiscal constraints and fiscal deficits and gaps, this is going to be difficult, but that's perhaps where some external support come in. And such fiscal frameworks will support the monetization of most forms of waste, reduce waste production, enhance recycling, and also penalize indiscriminate waste disposal. And the final point I want to make, and as we talk about alternatives to plastics, is that there is a significant opportunity for innovation, for investment, for production expansion, and for the emergence of new sectors and subsectors. And of course, there are the spillover effects or benefits for welfare gains for the entire society, including the environment on a whole. And in pursuing plastic substitutes, it is extremely important that we do not perpetuate long-standing structural inequalities where global production is concerned. In the OECS, we, as I mentioned before, we are very small economies, and we do not have very robust manufacturing bases, but that does not preclude the possibility of being able to develop some indigenous manufacturing capacity where plastics alternatives are concerned. And I believe that we should spare no effort in ensuring that countries like ours are also placed in a position where we can also produce and not necessarily simply replicate old patterns of relying almost exclusively on imports to satisfy our market requirements. David, I think I'll leave it there for now, and I'll be happy to engage further in the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joel. And you bring many important points. I just will summarize some. You put the point of the vulnerability of seeds to plastic pollution. You know, seeds are not only vulnerable to climate change, not only vulnerable to financial shocks, but also plastic pollution. So it's really a challenge for them. Also, the importance of and the impacts of plastic pollution to the blue economy, the importance of having waste management systems, fiscal incentives, and national policies and plans. So thank you very much, Joel. Also, we put in the chat an example that we help in Jamaica on the use of bamboo to do straws and substitute them in plastic. So it's a very nice experience, also a company led by women, which is very nice. Now we have a very important expert coming at the end. We have the best for the end. We have Terry McCormack, who is going to go deeper into more the technical analysis, life cycle, which are the most environmentally friendly substitutes, why we should go there, and what could be the options moving forward. Thank you, Terry, for your time, and welcome. We're all going a little bit late. I will ask participants to bear with us, but I see a lot of interest. We have not gone down almost in participants. Terry, please.
Thank you, David. If the people aren't dropping off, they probably will in a few minutes as I get started. My thanks to UNCTAD and to Henrique, and it's good to see Tess involved. That was my nickname at university where I studied chemistry. I want to make a few more general observations regarding the report, and there is a line in there which says, which cites the severe impact of plastics production on the global carbon budget through to the end of the century. But I would strike a more optimistic tone regarding business as usual, because I think the plastics industry is well aware of the challenges associated with circular economy, pollution, and resource efficiency. Also at the sector level, I think researchers such as those involved in packaging development display a very high level of ingenuity. Innovation was just touched on there. So the landscape is changing, maybe not quickly enough, but it is certainly changing. So when we have references in the report also to plastics per se, rather than only the majority emphasis, which I think should be placed, which is on linear economy, plastics waste, and pollution. So I think we need to have that deep focus in mind. Regarding life cycle thinking and plastics, which have been mentioned, I think it's important to not only concentrate on production and end of life, so we're fixated by manufacturing impacts and waste, but also to consider the use phase. The reasons for the deployment of plastics in applications in the first place. And often you will see that greenhouse gas savings in the use phase outweigh those of manufacturing and end of life impacts combined. And I think these potential savings should be considered when we're looking at substitutes going forward. Regarding substitute materials, this is the upstream innovation area. There are likely to be trade-offs, that's been said, and compromises, as not only, plastics have been in these applications for a long time. They're well, they've been optimized. They have a good LCA profile, although I take the point that we have to recognize the negative externalities like littering when we think about life cycle analyses. But the incumbent plastics tend to possess good functionality, they're available, and they are affordable. So they have a lot of things going in their favor. So several things to take into consideration as we look at substitution. I think for substitution in general, the starting point may be those challenged plastics items. And these are those that are prone to littering or ending up in the environment. They often represent a poor selection of choice in plastics anyway. So going forwards, introduce new alternative feedstocks into these applications. As they gain traction, then we can build upon this going forward and carry out the requisite development to address some of the more sophisticated applications. So to ensure that these new feedstocks can bed down going forward. So be selective, seek quick wins where there's going to be little resistance, demonstrate the potential, establish the track record, and then promote these new and alternative feedstocks and materials further. I do have a slide, but I don't know if we have time to put this up. And this is the SMEP program. Let me see if I can.
Please share it, and also you can give it to us and we can put it in the chat for everybody to have it.
Okay. It's just for those who are not familiar with the, not that one. Let's answer another one of the questions in the chat. It's this one. Now I'm struggling to get the right.
But tell us while you do, tell us what will be the content, so we can.
Okay, but basically, it is a picture of the scope of the SMEP program. So this is the call that was made for solutions to plastics pollution, and basically, I can find it in my thing here. Basically, the majority of the solutions that came forward concentrated on the end of pipe type of solutions. So they involve the repurposing or the remanufacturing of plastics waste from fast-moving consumer goods area and turning them into disposable items. So going from single-use to disposable or durable products. And it meant that there is a recognition of plastics waste as a resource. Increasingly, it's seen as an important resource. So this valorization of the waste materials demonstrates that waste is prized and that there is a market. And I think the more that can happen, the less you will see plastics materials being discarded, in the environment. So as I say, a lot of these were around end-of-pipe solutions, which emanate from single-use formats such as packaging, and applying what I would say is an open loop or an extended loop approach to these materials, giving them a second life and following circular economy principles. But I think as we're talking about here, one of the things that we wanted to look at was stemming the flow of plastics pollution in the first place, and that requires the upstream interventions. So that brings in the substitutes, the alternative material solutions, that some of which are being touched upon today. But I would say that furthermore, we also ask people to think about not just substitution, because there may be cases where it's not really viable. How about looking at new models of consumption? So is there another way of providing the service to society through a better design of product, for example, and a different way of consuming? So we also ask for this. And we also ask people to look at industrial symbiosis approaches along the production and the supply chains. So taking waste and using it as a resource. Within the scope as well of this particular program, we brought in the potential for biodegradable materials, as long as they applied in the correct context, being mindful of the ramifications for existing waste management and so forth. So really that is the additional kind of elements I wanted to bring in here in a rather synthetic way. I heard the point around policy developments. Yes, that's very important to supplement the uptake of new solutions, particularly extended producer responsibility schemes, because that's a way to provide the finance to achieve higher recycling rates and even to promote recycled content going forward. So there we are, rather synthetic, but that's all I want to say at this point.
Thank you very much, Terry. This was very useful, especially the importance of opportunities for design, modes of delivery business models that could also help to reduce even without having to use plastics, and also the point on the extended product responsibility and producer responsibility. This is very interesting. In UNTAC, we have a competition policy unit and consumer protection unit. I think we need to bridge explore that more from the point of view of the liability of the companies, whether as torts or directly under legal scope and regulations. So I think we have gone to the list of commentators. Enrique, 1 minute, and perhaps we should go to closing on any questions, points you want to make before we close.
Thank you, David, and thank you. Thanks all the commentators. Those are really good points. We are taking notes about the commentary provided so that we can write a small commentary article afterwards. And I myself will sleep over tonight with a lot of food for thought. So yeah, substitute materials, they have their own scenes. They have their own choices to be made at the trade level or at the local level. And as Joel said, they have a special impact on larger and smaller economies, especially on small island states. And it's part of the equation. As we've seen, the overall market for plastics will not substitute it for the different materials. We have to redesign things. Instead of getting soap in a sachet, we need to get soap in a bar or in a different system that we used to do before for hundreds of years. And those things can be done, can be re-implemented with a high-tech fashion, as we have many tools today. I don't have more comments now. I just like to announce, because there were many questions from the audience on whether the report is out. The report will be out in January. What we are going to do, we're going to send a post-meeting email with some information, some references, the fact sheets on HS codes, and also the study that UNCTAD just published today on the UNCTAD mandate and the governance for plastics alternatives. So yeah, that'll be all from my side. Thank you a lot, David. Back to you.
Thank you very much. I think we're going now to closing. First, I would like to thank our partner TESS for their wonderful support over this year. Also, we would like to recall that there are 3 important multilateral processes, perhaps 4th in the future, related to plastics. There will be discussions in the United Nations Environmental Assembly in March that may lead to a new mandate on a potential treaty on plastic pollution. There is also the informal dialogue on plastics. This is a learning process. This is a quest. So please engage. I think it's important to be part of the solution and not of the problem. So I will encourage all member states to really join and explore together with our support all the potential solutions for this big problem. Also, as was mentioned by Caroline, UNCTAD got a new mandate. For the first time, we got a mandate of plastics. So we're happy to work with all partners, whether member states, international governmental organizations, civil society, in this quest. You are not alone. Will help you to reach sustainable development by 2030 or early if possible. So thank you very much to all. Also, final thanks to everybody that made this possible: Caroline, Michael, Annalise, Daniela, Sebatra, Enrique, Joel, Mahesh, Terry, etc., for this wonderful event. And as we will keep you in touch, please look at the websites of both TESS and UNCTAD, and also the Geneva Environmental Network. And finally, I would like to mention that we one of the takeaways from this event is that we would like to also explore opportunities in enlarging that list of substitute to other products and explore with other organizations on that matter. Enrique, Caroline, any final word you may want to say? And we close.
Caroline, over to you.
I think Caroline had to leave early, so she's just, she conveyed her regrets.
Over to you, Mahesh.
Great. Well, thank you again. And I mean, thank you also to UNCTAD for the opportunity. I think it was a great session, and I really look forward to interacting with all of you and also with UNCTAD and on these issues. And I think there's a lot more exciting work to be done ahead.
Thank you very much. Have a lovely day.
Just a final thanks to the sponsor of one of the sponsors of this session, FCDO, which sponsors the Sustainable Manufacturing and Environmental Pollution Program. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all. Have a lovely day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ciao.
Goodbye.